Paul Feyerabend, I am not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but see Eduardo's pronunciation. He had a number of people correcting him at every whitey academic academy he went to. They would tell him how to pronounce Feyerabend correctly, you know, but it is a German word. So the thing I did for this week, the shorter of the two videos, was about the book called Against Method. And in the description, I put a link to the PDF. You can go have the whole book for free, yay. But Eduardo Barrera and I were kicking around the idea of writing a book against epistemology, or letting, what did we say? Let's see. The word Feyerabend had something to do with setting it aflame. Oh, Feyerabend is how we kept saying it. Feyerabend, you know. Anyway, so that's in the longer video. But the book Against Method, I just sort of went through some of the half a dozen prefaces that are for the book each time he rewrote it, and a little bit on the introduction. And I wanted to apply it to the Academy of Management, since several of us are in the Academy of Management, and Paul and Jerry and Sabine, this will be, you just kind of have to hang in there a little bit, sorry. But there is a silver lining for Sabine, since a lot of things that Paul Feyerabend talks about is what David Trofimo actually does with his assumption analysis, et cetera. But let's just take a look at it. Feyerabend says that there's a consistency viewpoint that happens in the pursuit of science in these academies. And they don't really want to look at alternatives. They want to reinforce the theories, concepts, and methods that are prominent in the journal and used by its reviewers and editors, et cetera. So this notion of a consistency condition that occupies the academies, and it may not be true in English or rhetoric or some of these other places or linguistic, but certainly I found it to be quite prominent in the Academy Management. In fact, I could see why Feyerabend wanted to promote anarchy. He wanted to have as many different theories and different methods and pursue as many different assumptions as possible, whereas the paradigm people, the Academy Management, want to sort of reinforce whatever they're doing, agency theory or Maslow's need structure or whatever it is. They're going to just reinforce and tweak it a little bit, but they're not going to go against it and refute it. So essentially, we do a lot of publications that are about a single theory or single model. And I've had letters from editors and reviewers saying, we cannot pursue this paper you've written because it needs to be grounded in the models and theories that the journal board members are familiar with. In other words, I have to take something new and translate it into the old models. I can't just say, here's a new approach, which is why I love YouTube. So what Feyerabend says is there's a way you can bump an existing theory when the facts sort of show that the theory is not holding up. And that's just his restatement of Thomas Kuhn's work throughout the book. But I think he goes further than Kuhn does, because in particular, he wants to develop something called the counter rule and replace induction. Just a little review. You have deduction, we deduce from the theory to the cases. We have induction, where we deduce from the cases to the theory, you know, goes the other way. And then there's abduction, which is from Popper, which is kind of these wild, harebrained ideas that don't have any basis in induction or deduction. Anyway, what Feyerabend wanted was a counter-induction. And he wanted to do this particularly to embarrass Karl Popper. So you might have noticed in the video, often Paul Feyerabend would go into a lecture. He was at Berkeley, for example, for a long time, or for a while, until he got sick of it and went to Switzerland, Sweden, or whatever. He would draw in 3-foot letters the word Aristotle. And then in letters that were less than 1/8 of an inch high, he would write Karl Popper. That's how much we really wanted to pursue this notion of the counter-induction and reject the notion of falsification. Now, I did a lot of writing on falsification with Grace Ann, and I actually have been advocating it for a number of years. So this was kind of new to me to be promoting anarchist work. But what he wants to do is expose the people that play the game in academia and call it science and show how it's not science. Now, one of his positive statements in the book, you can't find too many, but there are a few, is about Bruno Latour, science in the making. In other words, science doesn't just find new theory or whatever, and then it's science the way Bruno Latour wants. It's in the making. It's evolving and etc. But for Feyerabend against method, he would talk about it as AM. But I don't know. I tried that in the video, and I couldn't stay with it anyway. There was a notion that the correct idea of a thing is very often only a part of something and part of some indivisible process and cannot be separated and bring that process to a stop. In other words, the processes are moving, glumping along, and to try to separate something out and do an experiment or some other survey or whatever. The other thing he said, like an elegant theory, sophisticated research techniques, assumptions and principles that test extraordinarily well, he didn't buy them. He says that they're leaving out what David Trofimo calls the assumptions behind those theories, the assumptions behind those facts, the assumptions behind the method, every kind of assumption, because you can't test all these assumptions at the same time. You are sort of paring them down to reinforce whatever theory and fact that you're privileging. And facts for Feyerabend are ideological. They're not without critique, you know. So that was interesting to me. But another thing he said, we need to get a set of alternative assumptions. Again, I would refer you to David Trofimo. But he goes a bit further than David Trofimo here. And I hope David will forgive me and Sabine won't tell on me, but whatever. He says, you need a dream world so that you can understand the features of the so-called real world, which is actually just another dream world. So he's got an interesting notion of the anarchy of theory, but he wants to break this cycle of reinforcing a particular theory in his cadre of academies, academy management. And I go through some of critiquing my own article in Academy Management Journal just to show I'm not above critique here. So you critique the most familiar concepts, procedures, etc. Like in my Disney article, I can critique the most familiar understandings of Walt Disney, the grandfatherly figure, and the Disney film studio that does these wonderful films from fairy tales. And then I get into how those fairy tales are appropriated and monetized and, as a cultural appropriation machine. And Walt, as you know, had a very fascist side, which is why I pulled in the play Tomorrowland. But to critique my own article, Tomorrowland is theater, and I'm trying to apply this dream world of fascism in Mussolini, Italy, and apply it to Walt Disney and Disneyland. Now, I made some parallels, but I mean the elegant moves I did in technique were from Francois Lyotard and his postmodern critique. And I don't know if you know it, but he was kind of a closet Kantian. But we'll go another way. But that just, it leads you to understanding how I'm really taking a trip to the theater to apply it to a Disney corporation to pull out some insights, but they go against the dominant paradigm of systems theory. I was lucky that my reviewers were Stuart Clegg and Gibson Burrell and one other person, and I had a nice consulting editor too for a while. But after 5 rounds of revision, they assigned the whole project to a new editor, and he assigned it to a brand new review process, and I had to do 4 more rounds. And at the end, I actually changed. I was at the Academy of Management, I remember, and I'd gone to the meeting of the Academy of Management Journal editor, and he was telling everybody how to publish and how friendly the Academy of Management Journal is. And I raised my hand and said, look, I've had a paper and review there for, I don't know, over 5 years, and I would like to really get this done. And he, after the meeting, he says, how dare you confront me like that in front of the people in the room? What are you thinking? And I said, well, I'd like to be done with this, So he sent me the final revision after all the people had accepted it. And he circled 75 terms he said he didn't understand as a editor, things like, I don't know, epistemology and I don't know what the words were, but they were universalism, essentialism, critical systems, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there were 75 of these terms. And I was forced to write a definition of each of the 75 terms in the paper, which I guess people really love because they seem to cite the paper. I don't know. That's enough war story. But the idea is elegant theory that you submit to a journal. I originally submitted tape recordings of Ron Miller, Mike Eisner, and Walt Disney, and I analyzed the story tonalities and story choices of words of the 3 executives. And the reviewers, Clegg and whatnot, they didn't want any part of that. They only wanted to know about the theater play I went to. You know what I mean? They wanted me to do that and to get a lot more critical. So I did. I did what they all wanted. Facts come from a negotiation of different parties. So a journal article comes from a negotiation of different parties, of which you are the minority as an author. That was the point I think Feyerabend is making. Let's see. Scientific successes cannot be explained in a simple way, as my story just illustrated. Successful article, but who's got 5-6 years to waste going through those kind of review processes? I mean, it is important, but all right. Science is essentially anarchic, like an anarchy enterprise. Theoretical anarchies bring about more about humanistic approaches, and they're more likely to encourage progress than the law and order attention to bowing over and bending over to editors and their boards of reviewers, etc. In other words, there's a myth about Academy management is producing better science year by year, and really, once in a while, an anarchist like myself gets in the door. You know, I guess I will leave it at that, and that's just part of the introduction to the book. Hope I've given you enough incentive to actually read the book. So, but I want to bring Ronnie into this because Ronnie and I wrote that book about Lou Pondy. And if you remember, Ronnie, the last paper that Lou Pondy delivered to the Academy of Management, and he said that his own theory he wanted to falsify. First of all, he thought it was unsupported. His theory was that you could manage conflict in organizations and do various things. To do that, he was very famous for this model he produced out of his dissertation and throughout his career. But then at the end, he said, no, this model's unsupported because organizations are basically anarchies. And every once in a while they cooperate, but that's the exception, not the rule. In other words, he was saying that conflict, he thought of it as the exception, and usually you have cooperation. When in his analysis before he died, right before he died of cancer, in the lower back, he just, like 1 month he was great. The next month he had pain. The next month he was dead. It happened that fast. He said that corporations, universities, agencies, government are basically anarchies.